I'm glad to be here.
Okay. Holly?
I'd like prayers for Kim Robbins, who grew up here in Wilshire, as Kim Martin. The doctors about 18 months ago gave her 2 years to live with a lung tumor, inoperable, and so far it's stable right now. She has not had chemo since April. She went in the first of this month, had another test made for the tumors that have shown up in her lungs. The main one, the big one, is still stable. It had reduced some, it's still stable. One of them is too little, one of them is aggressive, and the other one is stable. So just pray for her. You know, this is my other daughter, and Kim's my other daughter, and she's very dear to me. She was one of my teenagers growing up, and I just need prayers for her.
Thank you. Thank you. Donna?
Prayer for my cousin in East Texas. He's home on hospice, and for his wife who...
Seems perfectly rational. One person seems crazy to another. So today we're talking about a model that's put forward by someone named Rene Girard. And this is, in its very simple form, we're told this. Humanity developed a pattern of violent sacrifice that was meant to assuage our guilt and appease the gods. And this worked, but it only worked temporarily. Jesus on the cross was the remedy that was really needed. Violence is the result of our sin. It is the presenting problem. And offering sacrifices throughout all cultures was the way that this was dealt with. And Jesus, in his work on the cross, was the ultimate fix to this problem. So one way to think about this is that there is this universal cultural, sociological desire to want to sacrifice something. And we've talked about that before. We see this across cultures. And if you think of that as sort of a universal attempt to deal with sin and guilt and the problems of the world, you can see how maybe there's a temporary fix. And he does a really good job of talking here about Girard's view of something that we might call the violence virus. And this is really from an anthropological view, a philosophical view, more than from a theological view that he's approaching this. When tribal leaders notice that things are reaching a fever pitch and there needs to be some pressure let off, they would sacrifice something or someone. So you might think of this also like if you've ever used a pressure cooker, right? You know that over a certain amount of time, it builds up pressure inside and you have to let it off. And that's sort of what this model is talking about. But with all other sacrifices, the pressure builds up again. There's never a permanent solution. But according to this view, Jesus becomes the ultimate solution by exposing the system for what it is. That Jesus is the, well, just lays it bare so that it no longer has, the violence of the world no longer has power. And this is all rooted, Girard says, because human beings want what others have, and that creates violence. This is the root of it. He calls this spread of violence a contagion, and it's his version of original sin. It's the problem that we've got to overcome here. So if violence is the virus, then sacrifice, he says, is the vaccine to the virus. All societies need a release from violence. And so an interesting point of this theory is that nearly every human society has a founding murder. I thought this was an interesting point. So in the Bible, we read about Cain and Abel. But if you know literature, you may also know about Romulus and Remus, Oedipus and Laius, Marduk and Tiamat. And you can go through different cultures and mythologies, and you can find sort of an original murder in the deal that's a symptom of violence. And this is where this idea sort of came to Gerard out of this. But here's a philosopher who actually develops a non-theological view that causes him to think theologically and become a Christian. Interesting turn of events here. The idea here is, just to read from the book, the story of Jesus tears away the veil of myth completely once and for all, showing that sacrificial violence is built on a lie. The lie embedded in myths of violence and sacrifice is that the victim deserved it. But by Jesus being an innocent victim, he demonstrates that the system of sacrifice is bankrupt, and it's a trade-off of violence against one victim for the sake of the mob. Now, let's pause and ask, what do you think about this view? Do you understand it? And what do you think about it? Pros, cons? What do you like about it? What do you not like about it? You're just stupefied by it. Anyone?
The world's not there.
Well, tell us that again in about 2 sentences. Sure.
So Gerard finds that there's a pattern in all of society toward violence, that we innately want what other people have. And this goes probably to the 7 deadly sins in some ways. But out of that, we are violent people inherently, and throughout societies and throughout generations, there has been a pressure valve that gets let off through sacrifice. Someone is made a scapegoat. In all cultures, in all places, someone becomes a scapegoat. That person gets blamed, whether they're guilty or not, and that sort of takes the air out until the pressure builds up again. Then you have to do the whole thing again.
Would that apply, I think it was in England where they stoned an immigrant to death thinking he was the man who had just...
Oh, so this is a current event. Yeah, if you saw this was a man from Eritrea.
Uh-huh.
And we know Eritreans, right? Our friends from the Gospel Light Church. So this is a man who has no doubt fled violence in his home country, right? Because Eritrea's got their own set of huge problems. And here he was, they thought that he was a terrorist, right? He was misidentified, probably because of his skin color. But the fever pitch of the crowd, with all that's going on in Europe now, was so intense that they needed to take out their anxiety on someone.
They beat him to death.
And they beat him to death.
And then found out who the other
Right.
perpetrator was.
And I think that's a good example of how this comes to be. And that's really no different than a tribal leader throwing someone in the volcano, back to Gilligan's Island here.
I always hated it. It was beautiful young maidens that got it.
Right. But the idea is, okay, we've got to offer a sacrifice to let off steam here, right?
I'm just wondering where all of the deaths and killings come just because somebody believes something different, which in many cases can't even be proven one way or the other. How does this tie into this thing about letting off steam and therefore killing people?
Well, so, yeah, his idea seems to be that we are bent toward violence because we are not satisfied with what we have.
Yeah, but this is another reason.
But a root of that type of thing is if someone challenges our belief system. then we're not content with what we have, right? We feel insecure in that. Yeah. So there's some problems with this view. Yeah.
Mark, what would have been in this case the steam they were letting off from? I mean, was it a terrible way to word that? I'm sorry. But what was the circumstance that they're mad because of the Roman occupation, or they're mad because they don't have
Oh,
a
with
strong
Jesus?
leader? Yeah, what's the
Oh,
the
no,
thing they're
yeah,
letting
Jesus
the
is a
steam
classic
out?
case here, because he came in and pretty well poked everyone in the eye. As we established several chapters ago, you'd be hard pressed to find someone Jesus didn't offend. He offended the Romans, he offended the Jewish leaders, he offended the tax collectors, and all of the power establishment Jesus was standing up against. And so it's easy for him to become the person who needs to be dealt with out of that.
Well, but is this theory stating that Jesus was the ultimate act of violence, or
Yes. So
after him that wasn't necessary anymore?
Right. So this theory says that Jesus, being innocent, was the ultimate sacrifice for this. Now, here's where we get into one of the problems with this theory, because it is a philosophical kind of proposition and not originally a theological idea. Jesus does not have to be divine for this theory to hold up. Jesus just has to be a really good person. And there is no requirement here that Jesus has to be God in this. That's one problem with this theory.
Mark, there was something on National Geographic the last week or so, and they were talking about the Druids.
Yes.
And sacrifice being the key word. A sacrifice can be a conquered person, an offending person, but they can also be groomed. They found a mummy, and this was a well-groomed, supposed high-born person, and they were designated at birth to be the sacrifice.
Mm.
And I mean, they had manicure.
That's advanced scapegoating.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So the reason this is called the mirror model, by the way, is given here. In Jesus' crucifixion, he says, God is holding up a mirror. We look at Jesus on the cross, and we see our own systems of violence and scapegoating reflected back at us, and realize that they are completely bankrupt. We see the reflection of Jesus. Okay, so here's some problems. This requires us to believe that God wanted sacrifice at some point. And it sort of goes along with this idea from one of our other theories that God sort of weaned people off of sacrifice. It was the original plan, but God was sort of weaning them off to another direction. It also says that God allowed humanity to evolve from primitive sacrifice to less primitive animal sacrifice until we were able to learn. So it's this progression that God would have learned. Gerard ultimately ends up believing in Jesus' divinity, but his version of the crucifixion doesn't depend upon the divinity of Jesus. Jesus' life is really just a precursor to his death. And we saw a similar problem with at least one or more of our other theories. There's also it's not necessary in this view for Jesus to be self-aware. This is not self-sacrifice on Jesus' part. This is really a game changer according to Gerard, because Jesus breaks the pattern of the sacrifice. According to this view, God didn't kill Jesus, but God let it happen. God didn't kill Jesus, but God let it happen. Now, one of the high points, the positives of this view, is that it really addresses head on the issue of violence. Why are we so violent? It's endemic, it's epidemic among humans, and it's inevitable because of our rivalries. And so you can see how this would really have a psychosocial kind of basis to it. All right? Now, further evaluation. Our author notes that this view has gained popularity among more liberal and progressive Christians. But, he says, if Girard accuses other theories of being arbitrary and even unjust, the same can be said of the God implicit in his view. In this view, the mirror model, God is passive, accepts the sacrificial system of the Hebrews, allows the mob to kill his own son. Yes, God uses the crucifixion to reveal the bankruptcy of scapegoating, but at what cost? Was Jesus a willing victim? And doesn't his victimhood simply add another body to the pile of victims? So he says the big problem here is that Girard is weak on God. Weak on God. His theory doesn't even really need God in it to hold water. It could have been a purely cultural and sociological force that led the early Christians to identify Jesus as the person who's going to be the ultimate scapegoat. Doesn't require God's interaction. However, he says, if we take this idea and infuse it with God, then it becomes more interesting to us. It's not just another innocent victim. It's the Son of God, and that makes a difference. Now, Girard's view pays no attention really to how the death of Jesus redeems us from sin. That's a problem. It also doesn't take into account that on the cross something cosmic happened. That this is supernatural in some way. And then the next big question is one we've asked of a lot of our theories. Okay, if Jesus' death supposedly solved violence, why do we still have so much violence in the world? Why has it not taken effect here? Could you say that Jesus really died for nothing in this case? Why has the world not changed more because of Jesus' death on the cross? Now, observations, comments about this view. Is there anything about this view that you like? Yeah.
Well, I'm
Jen?
an academic and an artist. So the academic in me loves this view because it's very logical.
Yeah.
Everything is just laid right out. It's very historical. But the artist in me is missing the kind of unseen aspects, like what's working that we can't see, that we can't just lay out logically, because there's a lot of that in our world too. But I think some of why that's missing is because he's an academic.
Right.
His writings are academic. They're philosophical. They're not theological.
Right.
And I've read Girard. I mean, he's brilliant, but he's not trying to talk about redemption. That's not his point. I think if you had coffee with him, he would talk about it. But I think in his writings, he's not going to do that because that's not what academics do.
That's a beautiful, that's so well said. Thank you. That's really, really helpful. Someone else? What do you like about this view? Is there even a thread or a nugget you would take out and say, I want to hold on to this?
Well, you said it didn't do away with violence, and I think that God knew that. He was crucified and sacrificed, not what had happened in the past, but what would happen in the future as we continue to.
Yeah, so we're back to this question that confronts us again and again about, okay, if Jesus is the answer, if Jesus is the solution to the problem, and the death of Jesus or the resurrection of Jesus or the death and resurrection of Jesus is the ultimate answer, then why do we still have the problem with us right now? And the way we get there most of the time is to say, well, this is a foreshadowing of the completion that's to happen later, but that's not always satisfactory in all these views. Jerry?
Well, yeah, it seems to me that there's no doctrine theological or otherwise, that's going to get rid of violence. And Jesus gets rid of violence in individuals, but not everybody's paying any attention to him or believing in him or even knows about him. But we see lives that get changed from lives of violence to lives of love, but they're not changed by a doctrine.
Could y'all hear that? Good point.
There's also the part about God letting the people kill Jesus that kind of sticks out to me, because that's going to be present in some of the other approaches that we have.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, what, a question we keep asking is, what was God's role in the death of Jesus?
right. I mean, that's what we're
What,
asking, right?
did God kill Jesus, the title of the book? Or did God let Jesus be killed? Or was Jesus killed over God's objections? Or what does this say? All right. I want to hop quickly through chapter 17, which gives us just a quick look, a very quick hit on some other lesser theories of the atonement. Just to round out our understanding that there are a lot of ways to look at this. One he calls the $1 trillion coin theory. And this is the idea that, number one, humanity in sin has incurred a massive debt to God. This sort of harkens back to Anselm and the payment model, right? But Jesus' death is like a coin or a deposit of infinite value that's been deposited into the bank of heaven. And as sinners, we draw from this infinite worth to pay the price for our sins. So this really is some sort of a variation on the payment model, the substitutionary atonement model. Now, there's a problem here, and it's ironic that we're discussing this on Reformation Sunday today, because you remember one of the sparks for the Reformation was the selling of indulgences by the Roman Catholic Church at the time. And this was based upon the church's teaching at that time that you went to purgatory after you died, and you had to work out the rest of your issues with God or sins, and depending on how much unresolved sin you had, the longer you spent in purgatory before you got to heaven. By the way, this is not taught anywhere in the Bible, but it was a convenient doctrine. And then you had this novel idea that if you paid to the church a certain amount of money, and the more you paid, the more you would lessen someone's time in purgatory. And so these were called indulgences that you could buy. And this is based really sort of in this idea that there's an infinite treasury of merit, is the language that's used, that's accrued by Jesus' death, and only the church could withdraw from that account and apply it to your debt. And if you would put a little coin in the coffer, it would help speed that along, and you along the way too.
Does it say that anywhere in the Bible?
No. No. So this sort of makes God as Tony Jones said, a soulless banker, just sitting in heaven behind a counting machine, keeping a record of every time we let God down and demanding a payment for his insulted honor. Well, that's not a very appealing view of God, but it's a view that has been held through time quite often. Okay, does that make sense? The next one is an interesting take called the lynching tree model. And this is from an African-American theologian who draws upon the uniquely American black experience to create his own form of liberation theology. And his beginning point is to say that white Americans and Romans in Jesus' day used the lynching tree and the cross then for the same purpose, to rule marginalized minorities with fear. You step out of line, you'll get lynched, or in the Roman times, you get crucified. And so then he says African Americans have appropriated the cross, ironically, as a symbol of liberation. And he brings the cross and the lynching tree together into one image that he says has the potential to unite black and white. According to his view, Jesus was the first lynchee who foreshadowed all the lynched black bodies on American soil. Every time a white mob lynched a black person, they lynched Jesus. The lynching tree, he says, is the cross in America. Okay? Here's a case that I want to make that could apply to several of these theories. That is a really interesting interpretation of what goes on in the world and the appropriation of God's love and an understanding of violence, but may not be all-encompassing enough to be a thoroughgoing view of the atonement. Which is to say, this metaphor here has a lot to teach us about violence and about fear and oppression, which goes to the root of the human condition. But this theory alone is not enough to give us a robust, throughout all time understanding of what Jesus did on the cross and the atonement. It might be one way of explaining that. Does that make sense?
I've never heard this before.
I hadn't either in this way. Yeah.
It gives you a window into the world as seen by a slave and their descendants.
Yeah.
But during the peace movement in the 60s and 70s, you would hear this a little bit from black churches, and it always made you mad because you felt like they were using it as an way off thing, and you just want to struggle and say, hey, pay attention.
Someone else on this? Anyone else heard this before? Okay. I think it's a helpful image, but it may not be sufficient to explain everything. And I think that's like others of our theories that are helpful images, but may not be the broad picture here. The next one is from a guy named Richard Beck, who focuses on the Hebrew obsession with purity, and his terminology is socio-moral disgust. So I just have to point that if you've not read this chapter, this is a choice paragraph here about some experiments that he did. So in one of those, or others did, a cockroach is dropped in a glass of apple juice and then removed. Even after the juice is boiled and the glass is washed, most people will not drink the juice. Right? Likewise, he says, most people will not eat a brownie that is baked into the shape of a dog turd. See what you learn in Sunday school? He says, once something is deemed disgusting, emotion overwhelms reason. Right?
I agree.
Right? But there are many other things we could apply this to as well. But according to this view, the power of the atonement begins with the incarnation, in which the perfectly clean and pure God enters the unclean body of a human who becomes Jesus. And in this act, a disgust boundary is crossed. Jesus violates these boundaries over and over again, touching lepers, touching blind men, touching women with bleeding issues, and ultimately Jesus becomes the object of disgust, despised and rejected by men. And Jesus ultimately violates almost every Hebrew purity law, and in this, God steps over these boundaries, makes the disgusting sacred, overturns the conventional wisdom of purity of those who are unclean, and brings them into God's own love. Well, again, I think this is a really interesting way of looking at redemption, but it may not be sufficient on its own to give us the really robust understanding of atonement that we need. What do you think about this view? Comments? Does it make sense to you? No turd-shaped brownies, please.
It just made me think about intent, and I wonder if that matters in any of these theories. If the purpose is that Christ was pure and was being sacrificed, know that he's pure, and I don't think they thought he was pure. They thought he was a troublemaker, he was weird, or
Oh,
lying.
okay, that's a good question.
Does that factor into this?
Yeah, if the people didn't think of Jesus as pure at his sacrifice, does it count?
Like when they throw the young maiden into the volcano, or this person with the druids that was raised for that purpose, they know their pedigree and their background and they're pure. But with him, I don't think they thought that. They thought he was.
Okay, that's a good point. Yeah. Someone else? Okay, the next one is looking at the atonement through the eyes of violence against women. This is a feminist view of the atonement, made popular by Rita Brock and Rebecca Parker. And the idea here is, according to their words, at the center of Western Christianity is the story of the cross, which claims God the Father required the death of his Son to save the world. We believe this theological claim sanctions violence. And they say that the atonement actually saves people not by violence, but by saving them from violence. Salvation to them is a process of healing that happens when we overcome violence, when we grieve the violence that's been done to us and in the world, and when we decide to survive in spite of the world's violence. Okay. Again, this is an interesting insight, but probably not an all-sufficient explanation of the atonement. No, okay. Next is a Korean view. And this is there's an interesting part of this that I hope you'll pay attention to. Andrew Sung Park is a Methodist theologian and a Korean, and his view is that Jesus' life and teachings, not just his death, are redemptive. And he says Jesus' death does this. It exposes violence and injustice of oppressors. It reflects the sin and wickedness of the world, and it shows the world how forgiveness comes. But the key here is he believes the death of Jesus released the Holy Spirit into the world. That it was the death of Jesus that allowed the Holy Spirit to be set loose in the world. And this goes to a Korean word called Han, H-A-N, transliterated. And this is a concept, a Korean concept of collective oppression that leads to feelings of hopelessness. That the death of Jesus overcomes this spirit of hopelessness in humanity by offering the ongoing companionship and new life through the gift of the Spirit. What do you think about that?
I think one part of it makes sense, because Jesus did say that, you know, when in John, around the 15th chapter, and he was telling them he had to go. They didn't want him to go. He said, if I don't go, then the Comforter will not come.
That's right.
So that one part, at least.
So there's one verse to support that,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
I like the positive nature of it.
It is,
Yeah.
yes, it's hopeful. Yeah.
Purposeful.
Yeah. Now, the last of this, I think this is the last one of this set, is, and I can't pronounce this Slovenian name. Some of you may be better at this than me. We'll call him Zizek. And his idea is indeed that Jesus did kill God. I'm sorry, Jesus killed God. His view is that what he calls the big other, God or fate, doesn't really exist, but is a fundamental idea necessary to humans, and is oppressive. God was never materially real. God was only real symbolically, real in the imaginations of people. And Jesus is not an emissary of God. Jesus is God. And that this is Jesus' death on the cross kills the unreality of God. Everyone understand that? That was sort of out there, right? Okay. What I want to do in our last few moments today is I'm going to look at the very first part of chapter 18, because we get here a recap of all the views that we've looked at, which is a good way to sort of put a bow around this for this week. And then in 2 weeks, we'll pick up how do we make sense of all this and where do we go from here. I know some of you are just itching to say, well, okay, I know a lot of things I don't believe now. What is it I'm going to believe, right? Okay, so here's a quick recap of what we've learned. Number one, the desire to sacrifice is rooted deep in human evolutionary psyche. We want to sacrifice something. Number two, Israel's sacrificial system was an improvement over, so animal sacrifice is an improvement over human sacrifice, which their neighbors, pagan neighbors, were doing. Number three, through the prophets, God expresses ambivalence about Israel's sacrifices. God values the sacrifices, but God prefers simple obedience. Number four, Jesus did not explicitly condemn the sacrificial system, but neither did he endorse it. Number five, the gospel writers saw Jesus' death as a Passover sacrifice. The gospel writers link and compare Jesus' death to the Passover sacrifice of the lamb. Next, Paul, though, considers the crucifixion the single event through which all faith and life should be understood, and he introduces the idea that Jesus' death atoned for human sin. Next, theologians of the church have introduced various ways to explain what God did in the crucifixion, and each has its own model, and here's a recap of what those models are that we've looked at. One is the idea that human sin takes away honor from God, and Jesus' death makes a payment for that sin. So again, if you remember the payment model, God's honor is pure and perfect. God is offended by our sin. God requires some payment for the sin that we have caused. There's a penalty for this, and Jesus comes and takes that and becomes the penalty for us. That's one view. The next view is that sin has made us humans the subjects of Satan, but the crucifixion is God's ultimate victory over the devil and evil in this cosmic battle between good and evil, between God and Satan. Number three, another one is that sin introduced a distance between humanity and God, and the cross is a magnet that draws us back to God. The next one is that sin diminished our capacity to be one with God, and Jesus' death restores our divinity, our likeness with God. Another view that we've read is that blood sacrifice allowed human society to develop by temporarily mitigating rivalries, but it institutionalized violence. And on the cross, God held up a mirror showing us that our sacrificial systems are ultimately bankrupt when we see them in the light of Jesus. And there are other variations here. Now, what I'd like to end with is this. Here's a statement that Tony makes in the book. If there's no good reason for the crucifixion, then there's no good reason to be a Christian. If the crucifixion doesn't bring us closer to God and inspire us to be more loving to one another, then we may as well abandon the faith altogether. What do you think of that? that is a challenging statement. If there's no good reason for the crucifixion, then there's no good reason to be a Christian. We're back to asking, why does this study that we're doing really even matter? Thoughts on this? Do you think the crucifixion matters that much?
Yes.
And why?
I think because as humans, we require a visceral response, something that we can see, experience with all of our senses, vision, hearing, mind, smelling, everything. And anything that just addresses one of those would not penetrate. It has to be the whole package.
Well,
Don't you think that since man considers himself the ultimate being, I mean, over animals and birds and stuff, we can think, we can reason, we can use tools, that for that reason we have inflicted it into our religion that your sacrifice should be the best. Since we are the best, we must sacrifice one of our own.
that seems to somehow be inherent in this, yeah.
John 3:16, it's because he loved us.
So
It's
could
an
you,
expression
yeah.
of God showing how much he loved us.
So here's the question. Could you have or know the love of God apart from the crucifixion?
I don't have to figure that out. I do.
Okay, that's a good answer too, right? Yeah. Kathy?
I'm probably saying this in a bad way. Jack and I have discussed this point endlessly over the years, and his point of view, which I might be misstating, is that the crucifixion is the ultimate exercise of man's free will, but that the resurrection is God's gentle and beautiful way of saying that his will not be thwarted.
Did y'all hear that? That's a good line. The crucifixion is the ultimate example of free will.
Free will.
But the resurrection is the ultimate example of God saying that God's own will not be thwarted.
So I think there was a choice there for man, that Jesus did not have to go all the way to this point. And it was man's free will that he did. But God still had his will in this, and it wasn't thwarted.
So at root, what we're getting to here is the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. Does that magically make a difference by the fact that they happened? Or are those events visible symbols to us of the love of God that already existed for us? Right? These are the questions we're going to continue to try to answer. I hope we're putting your brains to good work through this. Dave, we will pick up in 2 weeks in chapter 18 at that header that says smelling the cross. Smelling, yeah. There's a good story he tells there with that. All right. Remember, next week we'll be in the chapel. We'll have Vincent with us. Week after, we're doing diaper shower. We'll be back here and we'll pick up our lesson from there. And if you want to join us for the Thanksgiving dinner and sit at a discovery class table, sign up for that next week too. All right? Thanks, everyone.
All of those blessings that you